So I had, I'll say, a fairly soft agenda for today. Uh, Mostly start with an update on the wall construction projects. I know that there have been some conversations going on there. And then maybe after that, we'd go to talk about the SHPO grants and where they are with that. And then a brief conversation about the board resolution we'd talked about for hazardous materials, or a potential board a recommendation for a resolution, and some thoughts I've had on that. And then I think some open discussion then, if that's okay with folks. Is that, anyone like to add anything to the agenda?
How about we'll see?
Okay.
Thank you.
Uh, Paul, do you want to tell us about developments on the north and the east walls for um, where we are with asbestos and bidding and recommendations from?
You know, the way you put that, I wish I knew at this point. We, had a setback with the idea that, the paint on both walls contains lead and asbestos.
Or did that come back?
Paint,
It came back positive for the north wall as well?
yeah, yeah. Um, And I guess that kind of set us back at this point in terms of bidding these. We're sort of retrenching and figuring out, along with some contractors, which way to go on this. Um, right now we're sort of in the replanning phase. I just talked to Lisa and we're still trying to figure some ways around this and how do we accomplish, the structural needs here. And I said to her, I said, I put the repainting in the first place as a, just a visual thing. I mean, it wasn't part of structure at all. And if we can get around that, that's fine. I mean, we don't have to paint. No, the problem is there's pointing up, in those areas that need paint. She's also investigating the idea of using, again, I covered this before, of using flashing below the coping stones. And there's a really kind of a good reason for that. I originally kind of ruled that out because of the historic aspects of the building. But she feels that we can easily get SHPO's approval on that measure. And she pointed out what had happened at the YWCA, where they had a very similar wall and very similar coping stones and did all the work and it leaked again. And the flashing will prevent that. The flashing goes underneath the coping stones and protects, from leaks. Because otherwise too, you reseal the coping stones, but every couple of years, those joints need to be sealed again.
Right.
So if you miss that, you get leaks down there. All you need is one leak down there to freeze and thaw, and you get problems.
Right.
So anyway, we're looking into that, and we feel that that may save also some money on this project. We need to get the project done, but we need to get it done within the resources that we have.
What about timeline?
What's that?
What about timeline? I think there had been a conversation about needing to complete the work within a certain period of time, and I think there have been some updates on that. I just wonder.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, the timeline for both projects, the east wall and the north wall now, have been extended out. So we have essentially 2 years from June for each project. Both the public library construction project on the north wall and the DASNY project on the east wall.
So finish 2 years from this
Yes, we do.
June.
We do have the 2 years, however, we need to move this thing along.
Sure,
And so I keep at it in terms of, trying to get this thing going again.
of course.
To
Thank
the
you.
bidding stage.
Thank you. So I just want to make sure I had that noted correctly. So June 2022, we need to have the projects finished. And given the nature of the work, really doing exterior masonry work and re-roofing in April of 2022 probably is not a good idea. So you probably want to have the construction work finished next summer at the latest. Just broad brush sort of.
Yeah, I really wanted to
Conceptually.
finish this fall, but we'll see how far we can get. They can work right up, through into almost November. So
Yep. Yes.
I had to cancel my October vacation, so I'm set to go.
Okay. Thank you. I appreciate the update there. And so is
They wouldn't have
Spectrum?
let me in anyway, so.
So
Yeah.
you're working with Lisa at TAP on the architectural side and the bidding for the masonry piece, and Spectrum is advising on the abatement portion of this
Right.
in concert with them. And is Spectrum working directly for the library, or is Spectrum working for TAP?
Basically working for the library. I signed the contract.
Got it. But then they are coordinating with TAP.
Yes.
Okay.
I have a couple questions. So weren't bids supposed to be submitted by July 15th? So what happened with that?
They were pulled back because of, the issues involved.
So they were pulled back? Did we see them before they were pulled back?
No.
Okay.
I think if we had gotten bids, they would have been incomplete, significantly incomplete of the scope of work. So,
But they might have given us some insight as to what people thought, even before, without the abatement part. So that's why I was curious.
Maybe I think we have on the basic job. I think we have a fairly decent idea because one of the people who are interested in bidding on this is PCC Contracting, who did our original estimate. So without all of the hazardous material problem, I would expect the bids to come in pretty close to what they were on the estimate.
Paul, it may be worth a conversation with, you say, BCC Contracts? Is that who advised on the estimate?
Yes, that's who supplied the estimate.
I think Maria raises an interesting point. At least be worth a conversation with them and say, hey, I know this is not official, and I know that you've, but now that they've had a chance to look at it more closely, did they think their estimate was pretty good, or oh, by the way, they had forgotten something, and oh, we were 10%. No, we think this was actually 20% more than what we estimated previously. Just informally, to know that if there was a budget concern that they saw now that they were looking at it a second time, there might be an opportunity to dial something back or reduce scope if necessary. Well, we know we're going to have to reduce scope anyway because we have to address the asbestos, but it might help to at least inform informally.
Yeah, I don't know to what extent that they took hazardous materials into account.
They probably didn't.
Well, but I know that they didn't take all that paint into account.
Right. So, if they had a chance to look at things now, I think you pulled it back maybe a few days before the bids were due.
Yeah.
So they probably had started developing a pretty good number by then. It would be an informal conversation, and if they're willing to share that, that might be of interest. And you might ask Lisa if she wants to have that conversation.
Yeah.
I don't know how that would get framed, but
My other question was about the paint. I've heard different things. I've heard some people say that that whatever brick exists on some of our buildings needs to be painted. It can't withstand being exposed to the elements. But you feel the brick that we have at the library is not that kind of brick that needs to be painted?
My understanding is that our brick was designed to be painted.
Is designed to be painted.
That's my understanding at this point. As a way of sealing, but you know, the north side originally was painted, but most of it is worn off.
Mm-hmm.
And then the east side is pretty well covered right now. I mean, it was suggested to me not to paint the east side because it's already,
Not to repaint it because it
yeah,
was
yeah.
in good shape.
But I guess I'm still gathering information about what to do with the north side. Again, it's a matter of how much this thing is cost. If you have to take all the paint off both sides as a hazardous material, I can't even imagine what that's going to cost right now.
the other challenge with that would be, in order to take it off, the amount that would be required to define it as asbestos-free could actually be damaging to the brick. The process of removing the paint, you would end up taking off some of the brick and some of the mortar.
Yeah.
So I would want to get the expert input from your architect and the asbestos designer to understand what they would require, what the asbestos designer would require to remove the asbestos, and see what the impact would be on the brick.
So the asbestos is in all the paint?
So they say.
I think that when we spoke last, I believe the status was that it was confirmed on the entire east wall, and they were doing additional testing to confirm the extent on the north wall. So I'm assuming that the additional testing came back to indicate that that's all.
But there's definitely lead on the north wall in the paint.
The lead is pretty straightforward to deal with as a procedure that doesn't require great modification. The asbestos is another level of complexity, my understanding is.
And the lead's kind of expected with older buildings, so it would surprise me, kind of surprised me when you said, well, they weren't considering that there was lead that had to be addressed. Just because I would, I assume there's lead all over my building, which is a little bit older than the library.
Okay. Any other questions about the north wall or the east wall? Okay. Paul, is there any update from SHPO in terms of the historic structures report grant?
Yes, there was. They had sent me a couple of papers to sign, which I returned to them. They say that they were moving along, I guess, is the best I can put it at this point.
They had talked about that they were developing a new procurement process for professional services for these historic structures report, and that they may include the requirement for equal opportunity hiring practices or goals Did they mention anything about that?
No, not at this, not yet.
Okay. Okay. Well, glad to hear that there's movement. That's a good sign. We're moving in some direction. So-
Yes, it is. It's still alive and they are moving slowly, but
I'm glad to hear it too, because I had heard a rumor that the state was dragging its feet on these contracts because of the financial situation in which it finds itself. So,
Well, I think they've already achieved some of that objective there. So even if they finish it tomorrow, they still will have dragged their feet, in my personal opinion. But that's my editorializing there. Um, I'm just jotting notes here. I apologize. Thank you. Is there anything else to report on the historic structures grant? We're all set with that? For
we
now?
haven't
no.
we haven't heard anything from the Preservation League, have we, Paul? I'm
No,
not,
no,
I'm
I
not sure
haven't.
whether you would hear or I would hear.
Could be either one, but I haven't heard.
Oh, okay.
And what would we be waiting to hear from them on for the grant?
On the additional grant that we
Right.
Oh,
applied,
yeah, I'm sorry. Thank you.
and they had said, or I had read somewhere that they would be making announcements in July. But when I've checked their website, there was nothing, no update on when they were going to make announcing.
Thank you. I think last month when we met, we talked briefly about the potential recommendation from the committee to the board about a policy to to establish records and then maintain the records for hazardous building materials, and then a mandate for doing testing as part of that. I apologize. And there was a question about whether, in further conversations I've had with people involved with organizations, there's a question about what should be a policy and what should be a recommendation, what should be a board policy, what should be a committee policy, and what should be a practice. In terms of if we make it a board policy, then there is a taking on of a certain amount of responsibility and liability for that work. And is that a responsibility and liability that should rest with the library? Or is it a responsibility and liability that should rest with the design professionals being hired by the library? Now, in our professional practice at my office, we advise our clients on the need to comply with Industrial Code Rule 56 from New York State rules and regulations, and we advise the owners on the need to, what the steps are to meet those requirements to some degree. I would expect that when the library hires an architect for a service, that they would also advise the library on that. So if we were to establish a policy from the board, now we've taken that responsibility and liability. Is that something that we want to do? Is that something we should get advice from council before we make that a policy?
Yeah, I think since this does involve a certain level of liability, I think maybe we should have counsel involved.
certainly where there are projects where you're hiring a professional to advise, that certainly we want to make sure that the liability stays with the professional that we hire, assuming that's part of our contract.
Yeah, I guess any project here or at Lansingburg requires hazmat, you know, determination. We have some of that. We have a couple of different studies. You know, but they're here and there based on a couple of other projects that we've done. But yeah, I think you'd want a procedure that says specifically that, you know, hazmat detection will take place before any project, you know, and you'd have to define, you know, to what extent and, you know, what you do with results and all of that sort of thing. But again, once you admit that you're involved with hazardous materials, there's a liability.
Oh, sure. Sure. Well, even if you own the building, you own the materials. So that's part of the challenge with that. And I think the gray zone then is when we have projects that we are doing with our own forces or doing directly with outside contractors without professional consultation of a designer. And there could be, I think that's a gray zone. So again, I'd be interested in hearing what you know a legal professional would recommend. You know, insurance advice, legal counsel is my thought. And I know Maria, Evelyn, do you have any thoughts on that?
Was part of your concern not actually with when a hazardous material study was going to occur at the beginning versus at the end? At what level do we get into a liability issue if we recommend that contracts going forward or bidding going forward always asks that be done at the beginning versus at the end? And again, I know I'm not articulating that well, but I'm trying to put something that I don't understand architecturally in a question. But I know that was one of your concerns, that some of these studies were done too late instead of.
And that is what raised the concern initially here, that, you know, I think we've gotten a little surprised in these wall reconstruction projects with this determination at a late date. So that has set us back a little bit. And so I initially thought that maybe it would be wise for us to have a policy. But then if we had a formal policy as a board or as part of our manual, then we may be taking on liability to enforce that policy. And I'm not sure that's where that liability belongs.
So that's even if we indicate that should be done by our consultant or by our architect earlier versus later.
Exactly.
Okay, I need it.
And I'm not sure exactly. Yes.
Okay.
I apologize. I got ink on my hand and my pen is
Cool.
blowing up on me. So I apologize if I wipe my face or something like that. Pay no attention.
Inky fingers, you're an artiste.
No, I have a pen that just decided to quit, but so I apologize.
Tell people that. Say we're being artistic.
So why didn't we have have this done earlier? Was it not recommended earlier by our consultant? Is that what occurred? Where did things break down with this particular project?
Well, first of all, we would, we do hazardous material study before we do the project, but we don't usually do them before we apply for the grant.
Right, but the grant was applied for, what, 2-3 years ago?
A couple of years ago, yeah, 2018.
Oh, so
19.
in that process, we might have rewritten. We might have.
So, and now we were just about to do the project and only to find this out. So what happened? Something went wrong here that this wasn't identified earlier. And
And, you know,
perhaps it's good to identify so you can avoid it in the future.
was it, was it TAP that finally said, hey, we probably should do testing? Or did you go to TAP and say, should we do testing? How did that conversation transpire?
I'm sorry, what was the question?
For the north wall and the east wall, did TAP finally say, oh, by the way, we probably should do testing? Or did
Well,
you ask the
we knew
question?
we had to do hazardous material testing in order to begin the project. But like I said, we don't do that before we apply for the grant.
Right,
And
yeah.
since we weren't doing the project yet, we hadn't started the hazardous material testing. And again, that depends on the complications here and the difficulty of doing a hazardous material test. This is a fairly complicated project involving both walls. Hazardous material was discovered in a number of places, but many of those places were not a big problem. You know, so we expected that. As a matter of fact, we were seeing that early on, you know, in the silver paint, in the black material on the wall, all of which were fairly easy to deal with. So actually the paint issue was late. We didn't know that until the end of that report. We were getting the preliminary material, but it didn't indicate the problem with the paint. Lead paint, we've actually tested that. It's very simple to test. We've tested that when we did redid the handicap things, entrance ramp. You know, and that took, I don't know, 20 or 30 minutes. But this is not that kind of a project. There's a lot to look at up there. Masonry, there's, you know, several walls, there's parapet walls. There's a lot of different material that has been used over the years. So it took a while to do that.
So, but it sounds like in the past you've led the charge in terms of keeping track of making sure the testing gets done. That the design professional did not come to you and say, "Hey, we probably should do this now," or this is.
Yeah, I mean, basically, it's the library's responsibility ultimately to make sure, you know, that the testing has been done, that any abatement has been done before the project starts. So yeah, we do. We basically have been always doing that. But we didn't write that down, and there's a difference.
Yeah,
When you write that down, you know, then it becomes more of a legal kind of issue.
Agreed. And so, I was a little surprised to hear that there's a feeling that it's the library's responsibility. I wonder if the legal counsel would agree with that, or if they would feel that it'd be actually the design professional's responsibility to advise you.
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, the contractor does have some responsibility here. You know, yeah, his people are going into a situation. Are they going to be working with hazardous material? Are they not? So they have some responsibility as well.
I was referring to your architect. You know, the contractor, their, like you said, their responsibility is to take the information they're given with the materials that they have. But I'd be interested in hearing if the legal counsel's got any recommendations on this, or if the Upper Hudson Library. Association? System.
You're so
System.
close. That's so good.
Evelyn, I'm sorry. I will get there. it might
I
take
don't,
me a while. Upper
it takes time.
library system. I wonder if they might have some advice that they could offer on what their practices are, or organizational practices would be.
Yeah, generally, we'd find out if somebody locally has written down some procedures here. Generally, though, you look around at the library community in general for written recommendations, and then, see how they apply to your situation.
Right.
So
Folks,
it's not hard to find those things online.
well, one, Tim Burke of Upper Hudson often says, pretty much we've discussed every legal question, so ask us first. Two, Paul can bring this up at the directors meeting. And it's going to be a while before I can ask other members of the Upper Hudson board, but I can bring that up next time we do meet. And of course, the CDLC members, you can always get in touch with, Miss Call and say, hey, ask the lawyer.
Yeah, right. One of the things, though, when you talk about Upper Hudson, is that we're the oldest buildings in the system. Not everybody has old buildings.
True.
Many of them are, the last 10 years or so. So
But not all.
we're,
Anything from the 60s and earlier, could
Yeah.
easily have asbestos. So
so it's not a total concern like in everybody's mind all the time in our system because, like I said, we're about the oldest buildings out there.
But in general, this isn't just about asbestos. It's all about hazardous materials.
Yeah.
So it might be that there is a policy or someone understands how to do the policy, avoiding liability or not, that whole issue of liability in a policy, whatever the hazardous material is. So it doesn't even have to be an older building. Other buildings have had other hazardous materials.
well put, Evelyn. Thank you.
So it almost sounds like where things fell down was not starting the project sooner,
Yeah,
from what I'm hearing from you, because you were,
to get going quickly.
Or maybe not starting the investigation sooner once the scope of the project was known. I think it sounds like the scope of the project was known, and then the bidding documents were developed before having all the information in hand. So it seemed like maybe if once the project scope is known, to then do the testing in order to incorporate that test information into the bid documents.
okay, so it's 2 years since we were awarded the grant. So where in that process are you saying that should have begun?
Once the scope is known. So when you
So
go out
right
for the
after,
grant, when you go out for the grant, do you know the full scope of the project?
What's that?
When one goes out for a grant such as this, does one know we're going to do this wall from here to here, or is it more general?
Yeah, I I don't know if I can answer this. You can always, it's a good idea to start the project right when you have the money, I guess.
But when you write the grant says we're going to do the north wall. Is that correct?
Right.
So I would then, I guess if one knows after the grant has been written that you're going to do the north wall, and once the grant is received, then one of the first early things you'd want to do is to do hazardous materials testing at that point in the future, so that one could gather that data as part of the design process. When one hires one gets the grant, one hires an architect, one hires an environmental assessor or a hazardous materials surveyor at the same time, perhaps.
I think in this case too, we were kind of wanting to put these two projects together So I'm not sure the timing on that in terms of when the DASNY grant was finally settled.
It seemed to take a long time from what you have said,
Oh, they tell you that
Right.
right up front. I mean, when we even talked to John McDonald, they said this, those grants can take years before they're actually finalized. I can't remember the exact timing on that, but
It's been a long time.
the plan always was to put them together in some way that made sense, since they were pretty much similar.
Sure, sure. Yeah, we'll put down lessons learned, I think, and think
Mhm.
about how we might do our internal procedures. Regarding a board resolution, though, I think we probably want to table that resolution until we get more feedback from Upper Hudson Library System or from legal counsel or other people who can advise us in terms of how much, what the impact of that kind of a resolution would be in terms of the liability for the organization. Does that make sense to folks?
I think so. Paul says that he knows because of the experience he's had that he has to be concerned about hazardous materials. But it does make sense that is not necessarily typical, and that the hiring body has to rely on the professional consultant to let them know what needs to be done. So what you're saying makes a lot of sense to me.
Well, then I
And
recommend
just to be a,
please, Evelyn, go ahead.
I was just going to say, just to be a bit facetious, we don't even have to table this because it never was really a proposal. It was just an idea that we talked about and just talked about it now. So it just ignore this until.
Well, just for the benefit of the minutes and trying to be complete, which I'm working on, trying to get better at. So,
But it isn't anything formal, so it doesn't need to be tabled.
okay. As long as everyone's on board with taking that approach, I'm okay with saying we'll revisit this once we get feedback from a larger organization or from legal counsel.
Sounds good to me.
Okay. Okay. I've had some conversations with Evelyn. Evelyn has very kindly, and everyone on the committee has looked at the minutes of the previous meeting. Generally got positive comments back. Evelyn had some areas of concern. So there were some revisions to the minutes of the last meeting, and there was Evelyn has looked at it further, and I think she's got a few other pieces she wants to add to that. And Evelyn has done some research, shared out some research, which I will review as we move forward. I think the gist of the questions has to do with process. And that is, what is the mandate of the committee? Evelyn.
Well, it's partly that, but it is also partly the wording. So I wouldn't add anything. I just for me, I am concerned about how it's worded. So
Sure.
just shifting a couple, maybe two sentences and just literally repeating exactly what was said instead of adding a little bit more of a layering approach to it. And if you want, I'll play with some ideas of how I might do it constructively, so you don't have to go, "What the heck is she talking about?"
Well, we can
I
dig
send that
into
to you and see if you.
we can dig into the minutes of the previous meeting, and I'm happy to talk with you about that as we move
Okay.
forward. In terms of today's
Great.
meeting and moving forward with, is there anything that you want to talk about in terms of policy or process moving forward?
If anything, I've been thinking a lot about this, and I'll bring it up at a board meeting too. that was we look at the construction fund and what it is it was given a title by Paul, but in some regards, I'm thinking it could be called, you know, I'm not talking about the restricted. I'm talking about the unrestricted. It could have been called the money to be used account, instead of calling it a construction account.
You mean call it a
When I
slush
think
fund as
about
opposed to
some of the money that I know, I'm trying to be a little better than saying slush fund because that sounds so shady.
I'm just trying to,
But you know, there could have been another. I like that. I like it, but another, you know, could have had another label, and it could have been something as fund balance or reserve fund or whatever. At one point, it was decided to call it a construction fund, and everyone went, "Yeah, sure, fine." And then when monies came in, it was usually, where should we put it? Construction fund, because that's what it was
so it sounds
called.
like there was board action on where that money went to. It was identified
Not
as a construction fund,
there's
and there was a board direction or accepted that into that fund. Uh-oh.
We lost you there, Evelyn. What happened?
in the
Anyway.
sense, but it's only in conversation. There's motions. There was any movement. There was no any formal agreement. We all went, yeah, okay, sounds good enough. But it wasn't a deep dive in what should we call this? How is this going to be used? At the time, we were dealing with what if we absolutely positively need this money desperately, or we might have. But I'm just thinking of the bequests that went in there. I think one of them, which already was used for Lansingburg, had restriction of being used in Lansingburg, for Lansingburg, but it wasn't just for construction, it was for anything. The Medicus bequest, I don't believe had any restrictions whatsoever, and I know Mary Lou Cronin's did not have any restrictions on it, you know.
But they
so
were
I look
placed,
at that money, we were talking about, they were placed in this account. This account happens to have the name construction fund. And I want to be careful because otherwise people will start to fossilize. And I think that's what we're doing. And when I hear what you're interpreting it, you know what I'm saying? I'm hearing that fossilization of terms. And that's exactly what I'm saying we shouldn't be doing.
I think, you know, if we talk about moving forward, we can have a conversation certainly about how we move forward with new funds coming in. But if funds from the past were placed in a certain account in a certain way, I think we need to be very careful about reassigning that.
But
And I don't think that has always been the case. I know that funds that we've gotten from the foundation have gone in, and certainly the ones that I've been involved making arrangements for were to be used for construction. So certainly those funds.
But those, and I hope but those were for specific projects and were used for those specific projects, and it was for construction. But it's not all that money, all the money that is in that account was not specifically meant and never was, it was just convenient.
Well, it sounds though, and I wasn't necessarily there for all the time you were, but it sounds like it was a policy of the board that these funds coming in from sources like bequests be set aside to use for matching for construction.
It was not a policy of the board.
But it may not have been a policy, but that's what was done.
It was,
you know, if it was desired to do something else with it, why would it not be put in a different fund?
A differently named fund. We have an investment fund, for instance.
That's only a legal thing. We have an investment fund because we have to have an investment fund because we're a municipality. I just want to say that, you know, I guess the idea originally came from me in terms of the name construction fund, because having two buildings over 100 years old, construction was always the biggest problem.
Right.
And always needed the most money that we could come by outside of the operating budget. So it made sense to call it that. You know, with the changes that have recently taken place, construction may not be our only problem anymore that need extra money. Staying
Agreed.
operational may need extra funds at this point.
I don't disagree with
so-
that.
Really going forward, as far as I'm concerned, it needs to be looked at, because I don't think there was ever a resolution by the board to call it the construction fund. I can look it up, but I don't think there was.
Not in my time.
But the minute the budgets were accepted, there were budgets that were voted on and accepted. So I think if you can't just say, oh, well, this was a construction fund last month, now we're going to call this the slush fund.
No, it's
That
essentially
raises
a
concerns
reserve
to me.
fund. Now, most libraries have what's called a reserve fund. You know, and this is where money, perhaps extra money from the operating budget would end up at the end of the year, that sort of thing. Or donations, as we've seen in the past, and bequests. Um,
Maybe we need to establish one of those.
Yeah, I don't think there was ever a move or a resolution to call this officially the construction fund and to spend it only on construction. You know, I don't believe that was ever passed as a resolution.
But the budgets were accepted as part of a vote, and the budget line items were identified, I would assume. Is that safe to say?
I don't think that's in there.
What's that?
I don't think that's in our budget. That's not a budget item.
What?
That money in the construction fund, is that a line item in the budget? And
No,
just to
not.
clarify, while we internally pass the budget, you know, the public is not the budget. They pass the, I want to say the tithe. You know what I
Tax
mean? The,
The
tax levy.
tax
Thank you.
levy, yeah. So I'm asking about our fiduciary responsibility as board members on this question. So
Yeah.
could we get clarification if that term restricted and unrestricted construction funds is in the budget that is voted on?
Yeah, these things, I'm sorry, these are not listed in the budget. These are listed in the balance sheet,
Yep.
but not in the budget.
Nope, correct.
I think also that it's helpful to have a construction account that we can point to when we do apply for grants, saying, hey, we do have funds to make the match. They always look for that when you do apply for grants. They want to make sure that you will be able to fulfill your part of the bargain.
But
So
the
I think-
library construction grant does not require that you point to a specific savings account. They just want to see your bank balance. And
No,
we
but that's
send
not the
them-
only grant we apply for.
We send them our bank balance. That's what they see.
Well, and our budget is part of public records, so I think that they can see that as well. So it's helpful for me to understand what is on the budget and what is part of public information and what is not. So thank you for clarifying that. Look at, and I agree with Marie that having a dedicated funds available for construction purposes is beneficial for applying for grants as we move forward. But if it's not been identified, and then I think there is room for conversation in terms of what happened or what those, what the disposition of those funds would be.
Feel like there's Morse code occurring here.
Yes.
Um,
Is there any further discussion that people would like to have this afternoon? Okay. I think it's been very helpful and very valuable to conversation. I'm sure we'll continue this conversation as we go. And some of this may happen as part of the finance committee, and some of it may happen at the board level as well. Evelyn, I'll read your email in depth and detail and talk about that further. I'm going to make a promise to you right now that I'm going to do the minutes of this meeting this weekend, and I'm going to send it out before Monday. So as a draft to all of you. So I would value your review and comment on those as well.
Okay, thank you. I will say this, I prefer not to sit there and have to do a transcript of the next one again. It took a long time doing that.
And I thank you for your work on that. I appreciate that. That was above and beyond. You could have just, well, thank you.
No, I couldn't have. And it's for the library.
Excellent. Excellent. Then shall we say next meeting will be, let's see, today is the 24th. So our next meeting would be the 28th of August. Does that work for everybody?
I think so, but we haven't covered everything. What about the projects that we've talked about applying for the library construction for?
Do you want me to introduce? I got my other stuff here, all these other grant information.
Yeah, that would be great. Thanks.
I was waiting to be introduced.
I am sorry. I thought people would chime in at the beginning when I was asking if they want to add anything to the agenda. So please go right ahead. I apologize. I don't mean to cut you short.
We do have two other grant considerations right now. We've got the Cupola and Lansingburg project. You all might have thought that that was finally approved, but not so fast. I recently, actually last week, I received a notice that DASNY had a question about the cupola. And I don't even understand the question. But the question involved the paint, the primer and paint of the cupola, which they said it doesn't seem to be able to be covered by a bond. So you will have to pay for that out of your matching funds. And I said, sure, I'll do that. And that was the end of that, and DASNY's happy. So I guess we might get final approval on the cupola pretty soon. The other thing is the projects that we've been talking to, and I've been talking to Kirsten about, and he's supplied some excellent descriptions of. The water damage in the reading room on the 4 roof drains, and the floor in the basement kitchen, which turns out to be wooden, which needs to be poured concrete. Those two projects, an estimate is due August 1st. I talked to Bill Roush from Roush Brothers, and he is able to supply that estimate by then. I need to have just a brief description and the estimate and part of the application complete so I can send that to Upper Hudson by August 1st. But it's not, I don't have to do the complete grant until sometime later in the month. So that's on track to happen.
Were there any hazardous materials investigations?
What's that?
Were there any hazardous materials investigations?
No, not yet. There's going to be a question, you know, we put these two grants together. The kitchen floor may be no big deal, but work in the reading room, according to the estimator, is going to be a big deal. If that comes in really large, you know, we may have to concentrate on that work alone rather than put the two together. It just, from my perspective, but I'll know more when I see that estimate.
When you apply for the grant, you may want to put in a percentage markup to include potential hazardous materials.
Yeah, Bill had estimated, along with the idea that there's hazardous material in the existing plaster and paint. So abatement would be a part of that estimate up front.
Okay, good.
Matter of fact, they discussed how they're going to work with that and, so on. So I got a feeling that's going to come in large enough. So we may need to concentrate on that alone.
When you say that, do you have any idea of,
Over 100. Yeah, we're over 100, we think, on that one.
And, you may want to, if it proves to be too large, you may want to break it up into two pieces. Do it one end of the room first, do the other end of the room second.
Well, that's what we talked about, actually, because they have to use tents and that sort of thing. So they talked about doing half and half.
And that might make it easier logistically from an operational standpoint also.
Yeah.
And just to be, the downer here, Upper Hudson only has 444,000.
Yeah, that's the problem.
And the last two digits, I knew when I saw them meant something, so I'm not even sure if it was 87 or 53. It's one of those two, I think, but it's 444, 400 something. Plus our 9010, the 9010, it may not be triggered. We might have to go 75-25.
I don't see them applying the 90-10 to this round, not with a $400,000 to play with, because, everybody.
Well, yeah, there's not much.
No.
Plus, then there's that. Back, Lashiba. Plus, okay, so the 90-10 might not be triggered, and even if it is, then we have that 10% caveat of what we can go over.
Sure.
So it's just, again, not to be a downer, it's just let's be as rational and realistic as possible with what we might not be able to do. If we're even accepted as the bid, as our grant.
so the 10% caveat, what is that? I'm not clear what that means.
Now, I'm probably going to mangle the wording, but it is in the Upper Hudson report in our Dropbox, the exact wording. So let me see if I can do this without mangling not just the words, but the impact. No 90-10 distribution can go over 10% of the entirety that the system has received, which in this case would be the 444,400 and something, over what our 25% match would have been. So if our 25%, yeah, I know. This is how I'm getting it. If our match would
have to see the formula for that.
Oh God, I can't imagine. 25. Yes.
So with 100,000, our
Okay.
25% would have been 25,000,
Right.
and 10,000. So the difference between that is just 15,000. So
So
that wouldn't trigger that caveat, correct?
Hopefully, as far as I understand. But my math skills, my actual arithmetic math skills are, I'd have to actually see it on paper and think about it for a long time, but I think that's it. Because I went 10% of 444,000, blah, 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 is equal to X. How much over is that X over, like you said, with $100,000, $25,000. So
Right.
it's just something to keep in mind as we go through this. It's all about the formulas. It's all about, again, has the Directors Association given you any idea of who's applying, what they're applying for, and how big their projects are?
No, I haven't. We have no idea. We won't have any idea until August 1st.
Yeah, I figured, well, maybe someone had dropped a hint.
No, we didn't talk about it at all. Nobody nobody talked about. Matter of fact, Tim doesn't even know how many people are working on this thing yet.
Right day. Because
Um,
usually he knows.
But I just can't see the committee, in other words, with only 400,000 and 29 libraries, 22 of them may be applying, that the 90-10 is going to go into effect. They're just going to say there's not enough money to do this.
And
Especially when you come in as a 90-10 with over $100,000 in project there.
Oh, yeah. And not this year. It's
And
unlike,
that's why you may want to consider breaking it into 2 projects, if that makes sense.
so,
I'm sorry, Paul, did you say you're getting the estimates on the 1st of August?
What's that?
Did you say you're getting the estimates on the 1st of August?
Yes, that goes in the 1st of August.
And then as we submit it on the
Oh,
1st of
I hope
August?
to get it a day before, but
Okay. Well, thank you for the update. Is there anything else that we want to talk about at this time?
Can't think of anything.
yes, I'm ready to go home for dinner.
Okay. Okay. Well, thank you very much, everybody. Appreciate
Yes,
your
thank
time
you.
on this Friday afternoon, and we'll talk more. So I wish you a good weekend.
You
safe
too.
to you. Safe to all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Joy. Bye bye.